Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is seam ripping techniques. So I've prepared the next piece of fabric or sample muslin with 3 lines of stitching, regular straight stitching, 2.5 length, and I've back stitched at the beginning of each so that we can practice seam ripping that as well. So what we're going to do for the first technique. The first technique, and we're going to use the seam closest to the opening of the edges of fabric. And the reason we're going to do that is because this technique involves seam ripping straight down the center of the seam. This is the most risky way to seam rip, but it's necessary in some cases depending on the type of garment, where the seam is that needs to be ripped, and how easy it is to get to the stitches. So we're cutting down the channel of stitching to separate those stitches. Risky, very easy to cut a hole right into your fabric while you're sliding the blade down that channel of stitching, but it can be a very quick way to take out stitching. So it depends on the circumstance, but sometimes that is the best way to go about it. The second type would be to just cut each stitch individually, including our back stitches there, and just cut each stitch, pulling out, and you'll see it's releasing on the back as well, just pulling those stitches, cutting every couple, and then pulling the loose thread out on the back. Another great way. And that would again be cutting from the surface of the garment, so maybe that would be top stitching that needed to be removed. That's often the technique needed for removing top stitching. Our third technique, maybe for a long side seam, would be a case when I would use this. We're going to cut our first stitch and use our seam ripper to pull the stitches below it out until we have a long enough tail that we can actually pull this thread out. It's going to look like kind of like we're gathering, and we're going to cut a stitch further down in the garment and try to just gently smooth the fabric down that line of stitching and pull that thread actually right out. It's a very clean way to seam rip. Clean in that it also doesn't leave all of those little tiny bits that you have to get out later. So this is probably one of my favorite ways to seam rip when possible, because it really leaves the garment unscathed and the cleanup easy. So those are the 3 types of seam ripping techniques that I most common use.